there and welcome back to my channel where I post one new book review every week. Today I am talking about All the Dangerous Things by Stacy Willingham. Here are some quick content warnings for All the Dangerous Things. If you're thinking about checking out All the Dangerous Things, you don't have to worry about spoilers in this video. I always do a spoiler-free summary and then a spoiler-free review before I get into anything, and there will be a clear warning before any spoilers are revealed in this video. All the Dangerous Things tells the story of a sleep-deprived mother named Isabel who is doing everything in her power to try and figure out who kidnapped her son Mason. She turns her own living room into a one-person headquarters for crime investigation and attends true crime conferences where she gives speeches about her experience with the kidnapping. The people in her life, including her soon-to-be ex-husband and the detective on the case, show signs of worry that she's starting to become a bit unhinged, and they're urging her to try and find a way to move on. As Isabel continues to dig into the past, she discovers some unsettling details that may help her figure out why Mason went missing. We start to wonder if she's ever going to figure out who took her son from his crib that night, and if she's going to like the answer that she finds. Before I give my rating for All the Dangerous Things, let's do a quick run through of my rating system. 1 star means I couldn't finish the book. 2 stars means I struggled to finish. 3 stars means it was good and it was worth reading. 4 stars means I really liked it and I would recommend it to a friend. And 5 stars, my highest honor, means I would read the book again. I gave All the Dangerous Things a 3-star rating because I liked it and thought it was worth reading, but I would not recommend it to a friend or read it again. We are now entering the spoilery part of this video. If you think All the Dangerous Things sounds like your cup of tea and you don't want to be spoiled, now is the time to click away, go read it, and come back so you can see if you agree with my thoughts and opinions. If you like the sound of this book but you don't want to read it, I'm here for you and I will tell you everything that happens. All the Dangerous Things opens with our main character Isabel, who is readying herself to go on stage and give a speech at a true crime conference. We find out right away that Isabel is very sleep deprived and hasn't truly gotten a night of sleep since her son went missing a year ago. This inability to sleep is especially surprising for Isabel because she was once a very heavy sleeper, even being known to sleepwalk. As a little girl, she would wake up in the morning to find mud on her feet and realize that she had sleepwalked out to the marsh behind her family's home. In fact, the night that her little sister had a horrible accident and drowned in the marsh, Isabel woke up the next morning to find mud on her neck. She can't remember anything that happened that night, and her parents refuse to talk to her about it. On Isabel's flight home from the true crime conference, she finds herself sitting next to a famous podcaster. He gives her his card and asks if she would be willing to come on the show, and she brushes him off, asking him not too politely, just to leave her alone. Once she is home, she attends an event for Mason that's bordering on a memorial to recognize the 1-year anniversary of his kidnapping. Isabel is reminded that Ben, her soon-to-be ex-husband, and the detective on the case are not really super motivated to continue trying to discover what happened to her son. Ben shames her for her talk at the true crime conference and also informs her that he has begun seeing somebody else. Isabel isn't very surprised by the fact that Ben has moved on so quickly, seeing as how they actually began their own relationship while he was still married. The detective brushes her off when she tries to share some information about the people that she saw at the true crime conference, and most people assume that she gives her speeches about Mason as a way to make extra money. But Isabel actually only asks for a list of the people in attendance at the conference as a form of payment so that she can scour the list to try and find names that might connect to her son's case. When it becomes clear that the people at home aren't going to be much help, Isabel caves and makes the decision to call the podcaster, whose name is Waylon. He flies in and they have a few meetings going over the details of the case and preparing material for his podcast. They review the fact that the baby monitor in Mason's room had gone dead the night that he was kidnapped, leaving them without any footage of what happened in his room that night. Waylon asks if they can look at some of the footage before the night that he was kidnapped, and the two of them look at a few of the nights, and when they don't see anything of note, Waylon goes to bed. But Isabel stays up and keeps watching and finds realizes, to her horror, that she can see herself walking into her son's room and standing there staring at him for several hours before turning around and leaving again. She remembers how she used to sleepwalk as a kid, remembers what happened to her sister, and starts to have doubts about herself and her level of involvement with Mason's disappearance. Isabel starts to feel more and more unstable, and one night during one of her middle of the night walks, she decides to go on a different route than normal. While walking, she comes across a house that has an old man sitting on the porch. She stops to talk to the old man, who seems kind of confused at her introduction, and she realizes that from where he's sitting on his porch, he has a direct view of her son's window. The podcaster tells her that he can't afford to stay in town much longer, to which Isabel offers for him to stay in her guest room. Waylon tells her that he's going to head into town and talk to the detective and see if he can get his hands on some of the materials from the case. And shortly after he leaves, the detective stops by Isabel's house to tell her to stop poking around. And right after the detective leaves Isabel's house, she gets a call from Waylon, who says that he has just spoken with the detective. This is an obvious lie and puts Isabel on guard as she starts to wonder who Waylon really is and what his motives are, especially now that she's invited him to stay at her house. It seems like everyone, kind of including Isabel, starts to believe that she had something to do with hurting her son. She's on another walk and she stops to talk to the old man again, who tells her that they talk all the time when she's on her walks, which makes her realize that she must have been sleepwalking a lot more than she thought. And he also tells her that the last time she had stopped by to talk to him, the night that Mason went missing, she had him in her arms. Isabel is obviously very distraught about this and ends up confronting Waylon, asking him why he lied about seeing the detective. There is mounting evidence against Isabel at this point, including the fact that her dog would bark at anybody that it didn't know, and that it did not bark the night that Mason was kidnapped. Isabel starts to believe that Waylon thinks that she hurt her son, and so she kicks him out of the house and tells him to go home. After kicking Waylon out of the house, Isabel heads over to Ben's new house, where he is spending time with his new lover named Valerie. Isabel gets a moment alone with him and asks him if he also thinks that she has done something to Mason, and he basically tells her to get lost. So Isabel decides to do the last thing that she can think of, and she goes to her parents' house, deciding that she's finally going to get a clear answer about what had happened to her sister. Though her parents are reluctant to talk at first, they eventually cave, and Isabel discovers that it was her mother who was experiencing postpartum depression, who had taken both of the girls out to the marsh and drowned her sister. With her conscience somewhat cleared, Isabel returns home. While digging, Isabel discovers that Waylon is the brother of Ben's first wife. She calls him and discovers that not only is Waylon suspicious that Ben had something to do with his sister's death, but he's also suspicious that Ben had something to do with Mason's disappearance. Waylon and his family are the only ones who knew that she was actually pregnant at the time that she supposedly took her own life, and he claims that there is no way that she would have taken her own life while pregnant, and that leads him to believe that Ben had something to do with it. Waylon insists that Ben has a pattern of going to extreme measures when things aren't working out the way that he wants. When Isabel starts to see the logic in Waylon's suspicion of Ben, she decides that it's only right that she goes to warn Ben's new lover, Valerie. When Isabel shows up at Valerie's house to talk to her, Valerie is rightly shocked and a little afraid, but she does let Isabel in and decides to hear her out. When Isabel starts to suggest that Ben may have killed his first wife and also may have had something to do with Mason, Valerie does not like it and tells Isabel that she's crazy and she needs to leave. Isabel's on her way out the door when she turns and sees some pictures of Valerie and Ben together, and Isabel starts to realize that there are so many pictures and some of them date back to far more than a year ago when Mason went missing. Confronts Valerie about this, who admits that she and Ben have been together for more than a year, and Isabel starts to question her, asking where her son is. Valerie responds and says that he was an unhappy baby and anyone could have seen that, including her, which makes Isabel realize that Valerie had been in her home and had actually seen her son when she was there to see Ben. Isabel realizes that Alice snuck into the house that night using the spare key that Ben had given her, bypassed the dog, who didn't didn't bark because he knew her and took Mason from his crib without anybody noticing. Then, as Valerie was walking down the dark street with Mason in her arms, she went past the old man, and when she realized that he had seen her, all she had to do was say that it was Isabel. At this realization, Isabel quickly loses control and pushes Valerie back, who falls and hits her head pretty hard. Acting quickly, Isabel stages the scene, taking a ring that she's been keeping of Ben's and planting it under the couch. The detective comes to her home the next day and informs her that Ben has been arrested for murder and that they also may have a lead as to where her son is. Valerie had taken Mason and given him to a woman who was grieving the loss of her own child and who was willing to take a kidnapped child to replace her own. When the book ends, Isabel has Mason back and she is going to see Ben in prison. Ben tries to tell her that he's not the one who killed Valerie, and Isabel says that it's okay and that she would have done the same thing if she'd found out what Valerie had done. Then she wonders aloud how Valerie could have possibly known that the baby monitor had gone dead that night. This leaves Ben somewhat incredulous, and Isabel leaves and returns to her son. Now that you know everything that happens in All the Dangerous Things, I want to get into some of my thoughts and opinions about the story. One thing that I admired about this book was its ability to mislead as I was reading. I definitely thought the twist was going to be that Isabel had been the one to hurt her son, possibly while sleepwalking and without realizing it. So I did appreciate that it took a different direction other than the kind of obvious twist. The next thing that I appreciated about this book was the execution of her sleeplessness. I do think that anybody who has kind of been sleep deprived before understands the very jumpy feeling that you get when you're really tired. I used to work third shift, and I can say that when I was at work or even at home when I was tired, I would start to think that I was seeing things or get really startled by things that were pretty normal. And I thought that this was a nice detail and that it tied in nicely with the theme of kind of being unaware or sleeping on the fact that Ben was terrible, with her sleepwalking, and the themes of trust. Finding out that Waylon, the podcaster, was Ben's first wife's brother was actually also a pleasant surprise. I thought that it tied in nicely and just made everything come together at the end of the book. This is especially true because at one point during the book, Isabel asks him why he's even doing the true crime podcast, as it's kind of a sad and morose thing to spend your time doing, and he replies and says that it's actually because of his sister's unsolved murder. I also liked how Isabel made the transition from something of an accomplice with Ben to being his victim kind of at the end, because when she met Ben, he was still with his first wife and she got with him anyway. And then as we see her experience with Ben and Valerie, she gets to experience what the first wife must have gone through with Ben when she first met him. Another thing that I found really refreshing was the lack of a romantic interest between Waylon and Isabel. When she invited him to come stay at her house, I definitely thought that we were going to be seeing some romantic tension or maybe some sort of relationship blossom. And I feel like with the inappropriate relationships going on between Isabel and Ben, and then Ben and Valerie, it felt like something like that would have kind of muddied the message or made it a little bit too complicated, especially when it seems like Isabel's entire focus is on finding her son. When there was no romantic encounter, even at the end of the book, I was very relieved. So one of the things that I didn't love about All the Dangerous Things is the amount of flashbacks that we see. The book uses flashbacks to explain what happened to Isabel when she was a kid and her experience with sleepwalking and her mother who's experiencing postpartum depression and how that eventually led to her sister's accident. I did feel like the flashbacks took up a very significant part of the book, and a lot of times I thought that they were adding unnecessary detail to it and maybe taking some of the focus away from the current story, which felt a little bit more interesting to me. It did feel like a lot of the space within the book that could have been dedicated to more of Ben or more of Isabel or more of Waylon got swallowed up by some of these flashbacks. I am also obviously not a detective or a crime scene investigator, but I did feel kind of skeptical about Isabel's ability to clean up the crime scene and stage it so perfectly that nobody suspected that she had been there at all. It was kind of wondering how it was possible that nobody had seen her car outside of Valerie's house, and how, given the fact that Isabel was there for at least 20 minutes, she didn't leave like a hair or a fingerprint or anything that could have been used to place her at the scene. She does say that she wipes the ring down before planting it beneath the couch, but I just feel like, having seen some crime TV shows, that people can usually accidentally leave something behind when they don't mean to. So I was just a tiny bit skeptical that nobody questioned it at all, or that no evidence had surfaced of her being in Valerie's home. All the Dangerous Things has a lot going on with the idea of trust. First of all, we have sleep, which is a very open and vulnerable state to be in, and I think involves a lot of trust. There's a part in the book where Isabel talks about seeing Ben fall asleep for the first time and seeing how vulnerable he is in that state. And I think that we see that kind of in everything, you know, how Mason is taken in his sleep, how she invites Waylon to come sleep at her place, and then obviously with her sleepwalking and then her lack of being able to sleep after Mason is taken, which shows her kind of lack of trust in maybe just the world in general at that point. We see Isabel trusting and then not trusting and then trusting again, the detective, Ben, Waylon, and even herself. All in all, I thought All the Dangerous Things was a pretty interesting story, and if you're somebody who likes thrillers, you may enjoy it as well. You can check out the description below this video, or you can find me on Goodreads to see what I'm reading next. Thanks for watching.